Are we on? Let's go. Welcome to another episode of the OoruLabs podcast from Bengaluru. Ever complain how bad our cities are, how bad your commute is? You'll get to hear from people who are working to solve these problems in their own way. This is your weekly soapbox for urban sustainability. I am Satya Shankaran with Sonal Kulkarni. Today's guest, Professor Vinayak Bharne, is a presidential fellow of the University of Southern California Marshall School of Business. He's an adjunct professor at the USC School of Architecture, teaching simultaneously in the undergraduate and the graduate architecture, landscape architecture, and the heritage conservation programs. He's a former adjunct faculty at the USC Price School of Public Policy. He's also currently an affiliated faculty at the USC East Asian Studies Center, USC US China Institute, and the USC Shinzo Ito Center for Japanese religions and culture. His projects have received numerous local and national awards, including the 2013 National Award for Smart Growth Achievement, Overall Excellence by the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and the Excellence in Planning Implementation Award from the American Planning Associations. I'll put more of his accomplishments in the show notes because it's quite lengthy and he's quite accomplished. He's had more than 2 decades of experience all across the world in urban design and planning. And he serves on the board of directors of the nonprofit organization Union Station for Homeless Services in Pasadena. And more importantly, myself and Sonal have engaged with him on his magazine, The My Livable City, that he brings out as a part of his work. We'll talk about this and more. So I wanted to make a start with this whole concept of livable city, right? What is a livable city? Like, how do you define it?
Well, if you take the literal definition that is understood by everyone, it is usually defined as a city or a place that provides something like more equitability or equitable access to the fundamental essential necessities of life. So mobility, housing, food, education, access to work. It is also commonly defined as a place that gives equal opportunity for everyone to participate in cultural activities, civic activities, the economic life of the city, etc. More recently, with the pandemic and other things, the issue of health has come into the forefront. So livability now gets into the promotion of healthy wellness. Happiness is become an important factor. Community well-being is considered important. And then, of course, particularly in cities in the global south, but also in the global north, the concept of inclusiveness, the disparity between levels of poverty, the mitigation of those levels becomes important. And then, of course, framing all of this is the idea that the city doesn't impose burdens on the environment. So all of these concepts are universal now, and across the world, no matter where we are, these are generally accepted as some of the rules. And we even have empirical stats now that are every year bringing out the top lists of Vienna. This in 2023, I believe, became the most livable city in the world. But that's commonly how the idea of livability is understood. Of course, there's a lot more complexity to this definition, but that's a whole different discussion.
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to ask. Is that relative in nature, livability, or are there absolute numbers? You said there are empirical numbers now that you can apply. Is livability in a global south, in a country or a developing country like India or Africa, would they be the same as what it would be in Europe or America? How
I
does it
think
work?
that is the more pertinent question. So the clear answer is, like everything, there are common threads that unite these concepts, but there are also indigenous regional diversities that differentiate them, and that's just absolutely true for everything. Even a street, even our lives in a city are different. Even cities themselves are different. So just to give you an example, so everything that forms the definition that I described is something no one can deny. I mean, who wouldn't like to have the rights of a city accessible to everyone? Who would not like cities to mitigate income levels, to mitigate the disparity in income levels, etc., etc. But the fact is, cities are so different across the world, not because only how they look, but also because how they're governed every day. This is extremely important. And this is not a one versus the other. It is just that they're culturally different, their histories are different, they've evolved differently. So, for instance, because of complex histories, different trajectories of evolution, the contemporary conditions of cities are so different in their own right. For instance, Mumbai, if you take just pure empirical statistics, I believe has close to 1.1 square meters of public open space per person. If you take London, I believe it's around 31 or 32. If you take New York, it's about 25 or 26. Now, if you just take this stat, that take population density versus the area of the metropolitan region, and you divide it considering the open space that's available, what this means is you take simply an aspect called public space. It is not as simplistic as saying we're going to just provide public spaces and life will be okay. Well, the nature of public spaces is different. The expectations of public spaces are different. People's cultural norms are different. The universal goals are the same, but what this means is the processes through which we will be making different cities livable have to, number one, stem from their own realities, cultural, social, economic, and second, be extreme climatic, and second, be extremely sensitive to the fact that you don't unnecessarily or inadvertently universalize these, that you wipe away everything that is so beautiful about the urbanity there. For instance, cities in the global south, I've always argued, are a lot more resilient than cities in the global north. So when, a city like Vienna or some place in New Zealand gets a high index in terms of livability, that's okay. I mean, these are prosperous countries, their populations are small, they are affluent, they can do many things, and they deserve a lot of credit for it because they worked hard and they've managed their regulation and so on and so forth. But it is a false comparison, in my opinion, because you're comparing apples and oranges. Cities in the global south are grappling with histories, issues, notions that are significantly different today than those in the global north. So all this is to say is that an answer to your question, the universal applications, the universal aspirations of making cities livable, 100% spot on. But the the real discussion must not begin on what these cities ought to be, but what the processes to get there should be, and more importantly, who are the actual agents and actors that will generate real influence to get us there. Uh, Policy and regulation make a lot of difference in certain cities, but they may not be the only instruments that will be the torchbearers in other cities. So finding the conduits that will actually take us from one step to the next is really what I call practice in urbanism.
Practice leads us towards getting to a there, and the there right now is visual. We look at European cities, like you said, there is an aspiration of a clean, beautiful, walkable, well managed city which takes care of everything. But then the process to get there is long and hard because it is also directly proportional to the probably the economic growth of the place as well, because it's visually linked to that. So there is the urban planning angle, which is how you plan, which Sonal had some questions on. But from a livability perspective, just to drive that point home, is there a there that you aim for? And are the people who are there aiming for something else? Is this a constant arc, is what I'm getting at? Or is
Yeah,
there an end point to this? When do you know you have arrived in livability? Or is it a constantly changing kind of a target?
yeah, I think that is also a very good question. I always say it this way: cities are biological entities. Although we think of them as very sort of prosaic, static pieces, they're truly biological in the sense that they're constantly changing, constantly growing. Now, what does this mean? This means that every city is in a constant process of evolution. There are empirical stages where climatically, economically, you can really gauge, health-wise, you can gauge that certain things are not doing well. And you can forge methods and strategies to bring it to a particular point. So, for instance, if you take just the environmental index of a city and say a city is flooding or the heat island effect of a city is getting enormously out of control, you have to bring it to a particular level where uh, the entire section of the society, rich, poor, whatever the income levels, will actually be able to live properly. Affordability is another big issue. If prices are going out of control, we know that the market is doing that, and you can actually empirically bring in tactics and strategies to bring it down. So there is no question about the fact that part of what planning and urbanism is trying to do, in all the allied disciplines, is really keep a check on all this and bring it down. But again, the point that I'm constantly trying to drive is that this is different for different cities. For instance, one of the cities I return to every few years is Tokyo, because this is a city that I have learned so much from Tokyo that has toppled my preconceptions of what livability and ideal cities ought to be. Because uh, Tokyo is a city that has been destroyed continuously in its history, like literally. So I've always asked the question, how would I live in a city that I know will be destroyed from time to time because of earthquakes and tremors and uh, you know there are there have been epochs in which almost 50% of the city has been destroyed, and then it's been built again and built again and built again. So the urban form of Tokyo, for example, is very cacophonic to a Western eye because it has been built desperately, haphazardly. The rules are lax. But if you look at the pedestrianization, if you look at the way people live, and you look at the zoning that is entirely mixed use, you look at the districts where there is no single use zoning, but the land uses are stacked on top of each other, you can get pretty much everything you want within less than 15 minutes, or 10 minutes, or even 5 minutes. That is an incredible city to live in. So, there are, I guess the best way of putting it is, the different cities have different standards that they have set themselves, different bases that they have set themselves to generate a kind of an equitability. Let me say one more thing here. In the Netherlands, for example, which is a small country, a population very much controlled, affordability has been mitigated not by developers or by the government, but by intermediate organizations who are sort of bridges between the public and the private sector. And 70% of housing in Netherlands is rental housing. So again, it is a very different model of livability. You don't even have to buy a house. Buying a house is not considered a great thing. You just rent a house throughout your life and live happily, because the tax structure, the national rules, the federal regulations allow you, incentivize you, in fact, give you an advantage to doing this. So again, there is no universal answer to what the benchmark is. Different cities have forged different benchmarks, different methods, but the one thing that is common is that there is a science today that, based on each ecology of the city, you can actually empirically figure out where the temperature is rising, how much the temperature is rising, how it is affecting the health of the city, and what you can do about it.
Urban planning as a field has been evolving, right? And it dates back to Babylon or the Harappa. But what we see today is that in many parts of the world, cities have been sprawling thanks to like the real estate developers and the automobile. So today, urban planning is really playing catch up and nothing more, right? That's what we see in Indian cities, at least. I'd like to know from your experience, how relevant is urban planning in today's world? I mean, today's city building as a field. What is the role, or who defines how the city should be in the cities that you have actually helped? Urban plan, different roles that many of the players in the city play, for example, the
Right.
planners, designers, civil engineers, bureaucrats, politicians, citizens. So yeah, what is your experience?
In today's context, cities today are more complicated than any other time in human history. Partly because the process through which they have been formed is so over specialized. I mean, I'll just give you a simple, crazy example. If you take something as simple as a street, you know very well, because you've studied in the US and you've studied in India and you worked in India, the entities in the bureaucracy of the city that legally manage different aspects of the street are completely different. The sidewalk is managed by something else. If a tree falls down, it's managed by another department. If the mobility aspect, something happens in the middle, managed by another department. And many times the bureaucracy is so complex that they do not even talk to each other. Now take this and morph it, blow it up to the entire landscape of the city, from regional planning to, okay, and then morph it even more to all the allied disciplines that make the city: economics, health, public health, urban design, landscape, ecology, goes on, engineering, like you said. So the first point I want to make is city planning today has a sophisticated definition and an unsophisticated definition. The unsophisticated definition is that it has been reduced to a policy-centric profession where you're trained to be part of a bureaucracy and you're going to follow rules, and so occasionally if you're in power you may question them, but largely your whole career is spent in firefighting into all these rules, etc., etc., etc. And I'm not just talking of global south, global north too. I mean, you're mangled in policy and regulation, and that's essential because policy drives the legal framework everywhere. Sometimes it works, sometimes it's murky, but it is there. So that's one. So at its worst, planning has been reduced to this policy-centric profession. And it is then justified through social well-being, quoting Jane Jacobs, all that kind of good stuff. I'm being critical only because that is not how cities are made. Cities are made by everybody. If you don't have developers building a city, the economy would collapse. So developers are not our enemies. They are our friends. They're essential. At the same time, if you don't have ecologists talking about how to preserve the greatest heritage we have, which is our natural heritage, what are we doing? If you don't have a prosperous economy that is helping the underprivileged rise up, what are we doing? If you don't have food production that is feeding people. So everyone has a role to play in the city. What has happened because of over-specialization is that these fields have become siloed. I think we all know that. And so the discipline of urban planning has itself become siloed. It has gone into a tiny little room and all the other rooms. What I think the field, that's why I don't like to use the word urban planning anymore. I like to use the word urbanism. And this is a desperate word on my part or my other people's part, because we are trying to get away from normative definitions of urban planning. What we're saying is, imagine that we have the ability of getting people out of all these interdisciplinary, the different discipline silos, bringing them all to the same table and saying, okay, now we're talking of how to make a city, which is sitting together at the table and saying, all of us, there's no hierarchy here. All of us are talking to each other. We know something, but we only know a little bit of the answer. Let's figure out what it is. That is what urbanism is. So the way I usually describe it is like a symphony and a maestro. So, everyone has an instrument that they're very good at playing. A civil engineer knows things I don't. I know things that, a landscape architect doesn't. Landscape architect knows things I don't. So economists know things that none of us do. All of them are crucial for the city. So each of us is playing an instrument and we're very good at it. But there is no maestro. There is no composer. So each of us are playing in our silo, or we come out of our silo and we play whatever we want and we contradict the other, and so on and so forth. That's one. So bringing these disciplines together is what I'm saying is change the silos into a maestro discipline that we call urbanism. That's one. Second is a crucial point that many times now in cities, we are also beginning to think of the processes through which cities are being made, right? And the whole idea of top-down planning, where policy is the only salvage. For example, think of how scary this is. In the United States, which is one of the most regulated countries in the world, sprawl, as you mentioned, Sonal, is entirely legal. I mean, I just want you to understand the implications of how scary this is. So sprawl is not an accident. It is not a slum. It is not, a slum is a desperate manifestation of urbanism. People don't have food. They don't have shelter. It's desperate. I can condone that, but I cannot condone sprawl, because sprawl, every single element of it, a vast acres and acres of asphalt, suburban housing with no trees, front-loaded garages, you have to drive to get your carton of milk every day, freeways slashing through the city, bringing toxic fumes. All of this was done by policy and law. That is a problem. Now, why did this happen? because you were siloed. There were things that were happening where public health officials were not talking enough, other disciplines were not coming. So what I'm trying to say, Sonal, is that the cutting edge of where we need to go is to remove these silos and transform the aspirations of urban planning into becoming the discipline that it always used to be, which is bringing all these allied fields together and thinking together about how cities ought to become. Based on your first question, what is the livability of that specific city? This answer will never be given by policymakers alone. It needs a multidisciplinary, pronged approach that by everyone sitting and discussing it on the table.
You talked about Tokyo and Japan. I have been an admirer of how Tokyo is able to manage such massive populations with such efficiencies. Of course, there is a culture to how they work as well, and how they built their systems over the many decades. Of course, they lack a green cover that we can be proud of. But I guess that's what it takes to get where they got. But your observations, you've gone all the way from Middle East to Japan, and you've seen many countries, and you've seen Indian cities. The They are urbanizing at a rapid pace. So in the guise of increasing livability, we are also chasing economic prosperity. Guise was probably the wrong word. In our aspirational goals to become a high income economy and get pull everybody out of poverty, we are rapidly urbanizing, but the processes you mentioned are not strong, right? It appears to not be strong. There is a lot of organic contribution that you talk about coming in from all places, but these are not coherent or coordinated towards this goal of livability. They seem to be, to us at least from the outside, to a person like me observing and consuming the city, it appears to be just distinct pieces of hard infrastructure where this is a project, there is money put behind it, and the evidence of it is in front of you in the form of a road or a footpath or a flyover or whatever it is. And the only goals we seem to aspire for is, right now the latest fashion in Bengaluru is a tunnel road, because we've seen it in other places in isolation. We've seen the large interchanges and large highways that we see in the US in isolation, in the observation and the beauty of the symmetry of whatever it is or how grand it looks. That seems to be driving certain things, and the processes are quite weak, and you touched upon it more than once. What are these processes you talk about? What is it that is happening in governance and policy in Indian cities? What now is going to drive us forward? What is this process? What are the distinct things that you think we should focus on?
Let's do a comparative answer here. So if you look at the US, then I'll come to India. If you look at the US, for a long time, almost like half a century, if not more, an entire century, policy has still been a powerful instrument in transforming cities, at least in the United States. And that is because culturally, procedurally, the legal network and the reinforcement and accountability is pretty strong. I mean, as early as I think it was the 1930s when the idea of the democratic process came in. Public participation was introduced as a mandate, and that has held true. I mean, whether it has a lot of demerits, which we can talk about as well, but on the whole, 99.99% of mainstream planning in the United States is done through a transparent democratic process where you are required to involve the community. Now, whether the community comes or not is a different story, but you are required. And you also have the ability to be rather transparent about it. You can go and a citizen can go and stand in front of a planning commission or a design commission or a council and oppose the project if they don't like it. And therefore, the community and the citizen body has enormous say in what the city should be, whether it's a small project or a big project. This, of course, has many demerits. That's a separate question. But that is a system that exists. Now, the success story in the United States has happened at two levels. And I'll use this as a springing point to talk about India. Because the debacles of sprawl as a legal, policy-driven landscape has been recognized for its demerits, it has also been recognized that reversing this policy to make it more intelligent, more sustainable, more inclusive will be the path ahead. And so it is not just an idea that has come out of one mind. Today, the public sector and private sector in the United States are both geared towards the same goal. So when we talk about a subject like smart growth or public transit or public-private partnerships, all these are collective trajectories that are being done in the US. And I think it is fair to say that in the mundane landscape of the city, I'm talking of not the extremes, I'm not talking of the squatters or the high-end projects. I'm talking of 90% of the city that deals with everything you said, freeways, suburbs, everything, job centers. That is what is being healed through policy, which is fantastic because healing that middle city is affecting, in a good way, both sides of the economic extremes. So for a long time, what we have missed is that we have only focused on, oh, okay, let's talk about the extremes of the underprivileged, let's talk about the wealthy, but what about this middle that affects everyone? So I think repairing the sprawl landscape of the US through reversal of policy is actually a wonderful thing because it is changing the lives of everyone. For example, we know through statistics that the people who are actually suffering the most because of American sprawl are the people who are underprivileged, low income, because job centers are far away. So they have to actually spend more gas money to drive more to their job centers. Their housing becomes, more unaffordable compared to the salaries that they earn because rent prices are going up. So this vicious cycle has now been recognized, and there are hundreds of efforts in the US, literally, where in different parts of the US these things are happening. That's wonderful. That's a good thing. But remember, it has taken us more than 3 decades to just get to this point in the United States. And it's a long road, but the change has begun. In India, the situation is slightly different to begin with, because policy alone has never been the instrument to transform Indian cities, at least contemporary Indian cities. At the same time, I don't think it's fair to say that policy doesn't work. I mean, this is also a very important aspect. I would argue actually that in a place like India, where citizens have a very different relationship with their leaders, where there is this kind of more ambiguity, there's a murkiness to the accountability, there is whatever we may call it. I would argue that having a robust planning framework is actually your only safeguard in the court of law. In other words, think about it. If nothing is working or it's not working as well, if there is institutional underperformance, you need something that a citizen can say, you know what, I'm going to argue against this in the court of law. It may take me 10 years to get there, but I have something in my hand. I'll give you a simple example, regional plans. Why I think regional plans are extremely important in India. Why? Because a regional plan is your only legal document where the documentation of the no-touch areas and the conservation zones are actually recognized by the court of law. So in other words, if a regional plan is not there, or if it's haphazard, if it's murky, or it's done by whoever, and the documentation of the rivers, the wetlands, the no-touch areas, the forest zones are not accurately mapped, the court of law cannot really recognize them. So having top class planners doing really good mapping, doing fantastic regional planning, documenting things correctly is, I would say, as important in the global south, even more arguably than the global north, because it is your only safeguard. So to say that top down planning instruments don't work, in my opinion, is wrong. I mean, that I think is crucial. The second part of the answer is the beauty of places in the global south is that, unlike the global north, the processes of modernization have not yet eradicated the magic of informality. That is an amazing thing, because one of the things we are craving in cities in the global north is more informality, more spontaneity. Our cities in the global north are so manipulative. I mean, we are made to walk in 4 feet width of concrete on a street. I mean, it's good because you don't get into accidents, but everything is so clear that you have almost lost the joy of the spontaneous city. So we take parking lots now and make them farmers markets. I'm exaggerating, but I'm making a provocative point. The beauty of India is the beauty of cities in the global south like India is that the informal economy has always dominated our cities. And there is an enormous indigenous wisdom, indigenous tactical ways of thinking about what the city means, the appropriation of space, the resourceful use of city spaces. So there are two aspects to thinking of a city like aspects in India. I'm giving you a simplistic answer, but in the short time we have, just making 2 points. One is there is a place for top-down plan. That is the first point I want to make. That all the efforts you guys have been doing in Bangalore, such excellent efforts in educating the public through initiatives, in changing the mobility index, in initiating top-down projects by government agencies that are bringing alternative modes of transport. I mean, I've been fortunate to be part of some of them with you guys. These are extraordinary efforts, but they are happening from a policy level, from top down, and then being implemented. At the same time, we also need the space of urban design, the space of urbanism, urban planning, to step into the informal sector. Currently, this is the biggest puzzle in the world of urbanism. Because planners and urbanists are trained in a particular way, we do not have the lens or the empathy or the methods to engage with the informal sector. So we leave them as romantic pieces that are, oh my God, I'll either write about it or I will kind of intellectualize about it or observe it or be a voyeur. What we need for the informal sector is to create the containers that will enable this magic. So what does that mean? I mean, there are two aspects to it. I wrote this about in my book recently. One is to create the spaces, because the beauty of the informal sector is if you give them enough of the container, they know how to manage their spaces beautifully. But they need your support. They need garbage collection. They need economic incentives to get them started. They need shade. They need the supply of all the goods. These cannot be done through policy alone. So you need other entities to take care of them. So what is the question I often ask is, you have the informal, you have the formal, and they've become binaries in India today. You have a whole bureaucracy that knows very well how to deal with the bureaucratic engine of the top down. And then you have a whole set of academics mainly who are dealing and telling you the social life of the informal city is fantastic. You guys are ignoring it. Okay. The real question is, how do you bridge these two? And so for some of us, the answer is to embrace the idea that informality, formality, poverty and wealth are not contradictions. They are not binaries. They are concurrent realities. They are just simultaneous realities that are making Indian cities. And what we need, therefore, is urban design, urban planning to create strategies that are going to bridge both these ideas. On the one hand, create the spaces that will not tolerate, but embrace, help these wonderful entities that know so much about resourcefulness in minimal means to thrive and generate and keep alive the microeconomies that they're doing every day. And on the other hand, really talk about how to generate large scale prosperity, large scale change through public policy by continuing to strive to influence those actors that are not mainstream. So, there's a good chance that most of the people in the bureaucracy may not have the power or the vision to change the system. But for instance, I have worked in other parts of the world where the change in the city did not come from the bureaucrats or the leaders. It came from developers. I mean, not in India, in other parts of the world, but maybe they're in India. So in other words, if you have 5 or 6 influential developers who can bring a certain kind of project, certain kind of change in the place because you can give them additional density or an incentive, all these tools are now tactics to begin to forge a particular kind of change. So the other thing I'll say is, remember, there's a good chance that no one is going to do anything beyond business as usual unless you give them an incentive, whether it's in the informal or the formal sector. So this is where planning really comes in. What are these incentives? How do you make it happen? And somewhere in this lies a complex answer. But the bottom line, the key point is, find a way of bringing these two so-called binaries together and figure out how to create, how to tackle aspects of the city that will benefit them both simultaneously.
So one question on that was just going back to your example of how the West is now embracing more let's give a concrete example. Walking streets, mixed use, things like that are coming back after so many decades of going in a certain way. But if you talk to people here, it almost appears that visually they see a different aspirational goal of having this thing that the gentrified, segregated footpath on one side, large avenues with just motor vehicles moving with the pretext of having faster movement. That seems to rule the roost amongst the people in general. While the academia understands, and some of the cities have gone the other way, we don't understand that we are giving these things up that are already positive, going a certain way, and then we have to come right back. But we're already there, right? So something like Kolkata banning cycling in some streets or taking away the tram lines, which we have lost, and well, the Western world is bringing it back. So that's one aspect of it. uh, how do you deal with uh, that kind of prevailing mindset? And the second thing is the bureaucracy you talked about, right? There is urban planners are seen as these dreamy-eyed people who make ridiculous plans for the future, and the civil engineers seem to think projects. Let's build this or build that, and automatically that will lead to some kind of a livability, going towards livability, or be that as it may. The bureaucrats on one hand do not generally include market in a proper engagement way in terms of incentives. They're either captive to markets, in just lobbied way of being captive, or it's on the other extreme that markets are bad, we don't deal with them, we try to tell them what needs to be done. There doesn't seem to be an engagement where there is mutual motivation of, if we do this, like you said, the incentives and the disincentives. It doesn't seem appear to people on the outside a good dynamic, a healthy dynamic. There's either a capture or there's just complete avoidance. How do you deal with these two kinds of things that is plaguing our cities and our governance now?
So there are two questions there, and let's take them one by one. So your first question was about how, at least the way I read it, let's try and answer it this way. There is no question in my mind that the kind of regulation and almost over-regulation that exists in some cities in the global north is something that I think has a lot to teach cities in the global south. I've always said it. I've written about it as well. To say that cities in the global south should not crave a kind of a semblance of regulation as in the public domain of the city is wrong. I think we need to learn from it. At the same time, the point I'm making is not the schism between academics romanticizing, informality or anything like that. It's not as simple as that. What I'm getting at is that, you're right. We do need better sidewalks. There is no question about it. We do need sidewalks where my grandmother can walk properly, and I don't have to worry about accompanying her to the temple where she goes because I'm afraid that some. So all those things are crucial. Reinforcement, the management of the city needs to be important. That we can be uh, confident that someone is going to be accountable to making sure that every aspect of this is going to be maintained. And I mean, this is crucial, right? The maintenance of the city, the management of the city is important, not just doing it. So there is no question that cities in the global south have a lot to learn about how robust policy is reinforced, how it is made, what are the processes through which it is monitored, etc., etc. In this process, we should not forget how to try to bring in methods that accommodate the realities of Indian cities. One of the things that I have observed a lot, just to bring it into the discussion as a point of provocation, is the influence of, say, something as underestimated as religion. We don't even think about this, but close your eyes, go anywhere in your city, open your eyes. There's a good chance you're going to see a little dargah or a wayside shrine somewhere in your visual sphere. Now, what is that supposed to mean? To you, it may mean a spot that was anonymous, that is a infraction on the public domain. It happened. Nobody knows where it came from. All that is good. But if you look at it from a more objective standpoint, wayside shrines in India are the nodes of social gathering for an entire demographic at the end of their workday that don't have a place to go. So if you take a place like Mumbai or Delhi or any of the big metropolitan areas, thousands of wayside shrines every evening under street trees are the places of gathering. There's a little commerce around there because people gather, informal commerce gets formed. These are phenomena that are extremely resilient. In Mumbai, they tried to demolish the shrines many years ago. They came back. So what I'm saying is these are factors that we cannot pretend don't exist because they are so resilient, they are so powerful in the psyche of the culture that imports from Western planning that we have been playing with over the last 50 years cannot say, no, these things, we don't know how to grapple with it. So this is what I'm trying to say is the bridge. There are models that we can learn. All Indian cities today work under variations of Western instruments. We have to just acknowledge this reality. The modern city was born in the crucible of the West. So we may have varied it, we may have Indianized it, we may have done whatever, but the bottom line is zoning, Euclidean planning, all these are Western instruments, they're not Indian instruments. So life has moved on. We've gone beyond the colonial era. A lot of these instruments have come in. We are now grappling with them, struggling with them. But now there is the whole other side of Indian cities, which is observing what is the indigenous idea of the Indian city. What are the dialogues that are happening from the bottom up? And that's the bridge that you have to create. So on the one hand, talk about how to reform these instruments, talk about how these policy-driven instruments can really bring the big change that is required in our cities in terms of better planning, better conservation of natural features, greater access to transit and mobility for all. But at the same time, keep studying, keep observing, keep embracing these powerful forces that are having an effect on the Indian city, probably even to a greater degree than some of the top-down instruments are. That's the first part. The second part of the answer was the concepts of the indigenous hydro infrastructure, etc. Now, the reason I got interested in the subject is because it occurred to me that, isn't it ironic that we are blessed with 6 months of monsoons every year in India? And yet there is a water shortage. This is not a problem only in India, it's a problem in many cities in the global south. It's a contradiction of enormous proportions. So the empirical answer is, this is not an issue of water availability as it is in the deserts of Africa. This is an issue of water distribution, which means that planning our infrastructure has not been done in a serious way. The city has grown to such a degree, the infrastructure has not kept up with it, and therefore you are now unable to provide clean drinking water, which is a fundamental human right, to every faction of the city. So those of us who were interested in the other side of the story, we began to realize that indigenous systems, decentralized systems, have actually a way of reaching people, particularly demographics, that your top-down planning cannot. And that is why some of us have chosen to advocate, focus, do research, bring it into our design projects, that you don't need top-down instruments to have these massive pipes and large expenditures going for miles and miles and miles to bring water. There are indigenous methods that India is known for thousands of years. Your beautiful wells, there are so many incredible ways of thinking about not just harvesting water, taking it back into the earth, using it throughout the year, creating a cycle, because it is predictable. We are going to have rains every year. This is the most beautiful thing. There are two things that are amazing about India. One, we have rains every year. If we just know how to capture the water, architect it beautifully. You don't have to capture water in some dirty pond. There is a whole history of architectures and landscapes where water capturing and water harvesting and bringing it back into the earth was aggrandized into the greatest social spaces. So that is, science is there. We just need to bring it back. Second, seasons change. So as the monsoon goes away, these spaces can be used for something else. You could channel that water back into the nalas and the streams and replenish them. All of this is available. It has been done for hundreds of years. Our cities have forgotten it. That's one. And the second is decentralizing the water issue also has the advantage of making it available to a demographic that doesn't have it right now. So rather than waiting for a power plant to bring water, if a individual community, individual neighborhood was able to harvest the water, clean the water in the very passive means, any landscape architect of good bearing will tell you it is so easy to do it today. You can make it happen. So that is second answer. The third part of your question goes to the aspect. I'll use developers in this case. Uh, you know, because your question was about the market.
Yeah.
Now, and you are right in that. I think we succumb to the market. We are enslaved by the market rather than negotiating it. And here's how we have come to deal with it. Um, you know, the market is the market, right? I mean, the economy is a complex subject that many of us in the built environment fields do not have the ability to change or influence or anything. It is a force like the climate. It is something, it is a climate of sorts that enters and you have to deal with it. You have to negotiate it. But if you think about how we negotiate with climate, what do? We observe it carefully, and then at its best, we create entities that are architectural, urban, whatever we do, uh, that create the comfort conditions that we want inside, but generate beautiful things. And that's what we call architecture and everything else. In the same way, development, in the space of development, not architecture, development, which is housing, affordable housing, creating town centers, creating village centers, commercial centers, CBDs, all these things that make the city every day are products of the market. There is no question about it. No developer is going to invest money unless they have an ROI. It just doesn't work. So this is where the science of urban design becomes so important. This is why the field of urban design has stepped up now. Why? Because and we saw this big time in India, the rift that happened in India over the last, since the post-independence era, I would argue, is that the field of the built environment was completely dominated by a handful of Western trained architects with a capital A. Okay, maybe one or two of them wrote and tried because they understood it very well. They tried very hard to get into issues of urban planning, but they were so bogged down in the end with the bureaucracy and the processes that at the end nothing came out of it. So if you look at their monographs and their books and their whole life's work, the amount of influence that they had on changing the urban planning regime in India is absolutely minimal, almost negligible. But the amount of commentary that was done in the world of architecture to create the Indian identity, which was a big thing at that time, post-colonial era, talking about Indianness, all these things are fantastic. So architecturally, they shot to global limelight and created beautiful buildings, etc., etc. But on the urbanism side, I would argue the discussion was comparatively absolutely paltry. I'm not saying they didn't try. I think some of them, a handful of them, one or two of them, I can take names. I don't want to take names, but I think we know who they are. Were extraordinary. They understood. They knew what they were talking about, and they wrote about it, etc. But 90% of the very good so-called star architects in India were happy doing buildings, and they were not interested in talking about how buildings relate to cities, how buildings relate to the market. The market question was never brought in. If you think about the portfolio of many of these architects, they either did fantastic projects in the name of low-income housing, right? Beautiful, which is one end of the spectrum, or they did beautiful institutions, museums, all kinds of things. But most of the people who became famous for their good work never dealt with the middle muck of the city. They did not deal with developers. They did not talk about, they did not give us alternatives to tackling issues of mainstream development. They did not get into issues of the nexus of architecture with mobility, with architecture and ecology. Landscape was a profession that was kept as a footnote, I would argue, over the last 50 years. Only now landscape in India has come up, and it infuriates me. Conservation was left as a end note somewhere. Only now conservation has come up. So this is a huge problem that happened for an entire generation, not because they wanted it this way, but because the context was not ready. They tried, but the soil was not ready. Now I think we really have a chance to do so, because urban design, urbanism, all these allied fields are well established in India. I mean, look around you. Everybody knows, at least in our built environment field, people know that this matters. So urban design is a field that I think has a very important place in India in negotiating the whims of the market versus the form of the city. This is where urban design really plays such a crucial role. So, for instance, FSI, coverage, all these bureaucratic terms, how do you now begin to rethink them in terms of not just your own building? This is the critical question, not just my plot, but really the entire precinct. In other words, can you not compromise your FSI? Take your maximum FSI. Who has told you not to take a maximum FSI? Maybe exceed it in the name of doing some public good. Put more money, do something better, and get even more FSI if you want. There's no problem. But at the same time, are you being progressive? Can we reduce your parking ratio? Can you bring in public transit? So you can reduce the number of cars, increase the FSI. Can you actually prepare your street with adequate infrastructure so the increased FSI will actually have proper water supply? Can you actually harvest water so the water pressure and the amount of water that is being recycled is sustainable? This is where planning can really change India. Now, so another way of saying it is this cannot happen on a city-wide scale in India. I think the way to do it is like the way you guys have done your mobility projects on a decentralized scale, neighborhood to neighborhood to neighborhood. So, if you can take a particular neighborhood or take a particular development, a built from scratch development that is coming up, you could incentivize that developer. The planning bureaucracy of the city can be progressive enough to say, we're going to negotiate with you. We will put in some money. We will put in this. But you have to give us a water harvesting strategy. We will give you more FSI, but you have to make sure parking ratios are reduced. So this kind of give and take is what we have been trying to do in the United States. It has been successful in many cases. And I think these are the kind of things we should be keeping our eyes open to in India, because that is what market-driven urbanism is really about, a constant negotiation between the whims of the market and trying to create semblances of urbanism that are mutually beneficial.
It's interesting that you say that Indian cities are really livable because of its informality, right? I mean, it's it's a it's a different experience in South Asian cities because of the informality that exists here. So, but there is a struggle with urban planners and bureaucrats and even politicians as to how to really regulate this, or how to make this informality work in cities. So what do you think is the answer to this? How much to regulate and what becomes over regulated and loses that, that the heart of informality. So how do we balance it out?
Yeah, I mean, if I had this answer, Sonal, I would have, happily, what do you say, announced it. I don't have the answer. Perhaps many of us do not have the answer. I think all of us are still trying to figure out what this means. But some thoughts. I think that's a better way of clarifying it. Some thoughts. I don't think it is possible to regulate an entire city. It is not, because the spontaneity and the conviviality, the appropriation mechanisms of the informal economy are so, on the one hand, uncanny, beautiful, and so powerful is the best word I can use, that it is an unstoppable force. It is like plants in a monsoon climate. You can keep removing them, but they will just sprout. That is the nature of nature. That is so beautiful. It is an unstoppable force, and I think it is a beautiful thing, because it is what humans do at their best. We are amazingly adaptable, intelligent creatures. Informal economies are really about constant adaptation. That is what we can learn from them. But that is not an over romantic take. I'm not over romanticizing it. Your question is very good. How do we create a certain discipline? Because at its worst, they can really create unhygienic spaces. They can do many things that we don't like. Okay. So the only thought I have had is that on a smaller scale, on the scale of a village, town, district, neighborhood, it is possible to ask a number of questions. So let me say it this way. The former Indian town planner Edgar Ribeiro, who is a very well-known figure, he's retired. He lives in Goa now. He's a great senior mentor, and I talked to him many times about this. Someone who has fathomed town planning in India for decades. He has always argued that through his years of experience, and I want to just acknowledge him here, is he said, local area planning is the answer to Indian cities, and I for one, agree with him. I mean, for me, that's a very crazy thing to say. He's a great town planner, but I'm saying as a student of his, as someone who has read his work and followed his work, I agree with Professor Ribeiro, because what he's trying to say is that we are going to have a bigger impact in India, not by putting policy on a very large scale, but by really looking at pieces on a smaller scale and begin to figure out strategies of how we can tackle one and then go to the other, to the other, to the other. So regional plans are important because they talk about big scale preservation, etc. But local area planning is going to be the answer to Indian cities. Now, what does local area planning mean? In a local area, whatever the scale is, which needs to be determined, you can regulate, in my opinion, you can regulate a local area to various degrees by observing the city or observing the local area very carefully. For example, we know throughout the world, Los Angeles, Santiago, Buenos Aires, you look anywhere, you cannot overregulate vending. We all know this. You can regulate it, you can legalize it. But the moment you start over-regulating it, you've destroyed the economy, because vendors are like their own ecology. They know where to stand, they know where to move. They need a certain kind of freedom to keep that economy going. We don't understand it. So over-regulating every detail of an informal economy is a problem. At the same time, figuring out through constant observation where informal activity is happening in the city. Why is it happening in the city? Is it happening at the fringe of neighborhoods? Are those areas worthy of defining differently? For example, you can have a housing area. Typically, most of these vendors come at the fringe of the neighborhoods. And I've seen this in so many cities, Pune, Mumbai, where the fringe streets of the neighborhoods are the places where magically you get practically everything you want every day. How can we talk about the spaces in a way that really give them everything? How can garbage trucks come every day? Is there a way that urbanism, urban design, planning, policy could really talk about local area plans that embrace these aspects? That's point number one. There are other parts of the local area plan where the regulation may have to be extremely strict. Why? Because there is a historic building, there is a river, there is a historic heritage, natural heritage aspect, a wetland of such crucial importance that if you don't regulate it with the highest stringency, you are not doing your job. I mean, we cannot say we're going to, let anything happen anywhere. So there are places where we need to put our foot down and turn the flame up and write policy, write reinforcement rules, make sure they are manifest in extremely serious ways to make sure that these features are not compromised. There are places where we can write policy that have the basic armature and let things happen to a certain degree. And then there are other parts of the city where we just have to keep our mouth shut and get out of the way. Because there are parts of the city where regulation simply doesn't have meaning. Life has to go on. That may be a potential starting point to where we want to go in India, because Indian cities are so complicated. So my thoughts, not an answer, my thoughts are focus on local area plans, focus on very empirical observation, constant observation, not I did it 5 years ago and now I'm going to do a plan. Constant observation on what the pulse of the behavior of that local area plan is, and figuring out where to regulate, where to less regulate, and where to not regulate and get out.
Amazing. So I think each one of these deserves a podcast in itself. So you need to come back on and talk to us about some of these things, because I do see that the kind of dynamism you are suggesting, either in the ability to make trade-offs at the local level, is probably not empowered by policy, the people at the local level. Let's assume we need to make this dynamism at a ward level. I don't think the ward engineers are empowered to make these choices or make these trade-offs with the businesses there. Of course, they do it informally. Look the other way. and let the people do what they want to do. But and the other part of it is, can we write such dynamic policies nicely enough that it allows for looking away at some places and not looking away in other places and doing this? The way I understood it as a common person is, structurally also, I think we may need to do some work around how local area planning works. This is one of the conversations I had with Anjali as well, is how do we do these local area plans? And the last episode with Ravichandra as well was about how trying to decentralize Bengaluru into different pieces might help us empower as local as possible. Be that as it may, I'd like to bring the focus back on the US, because I have been uh, hearing of certain things. Of course, I already know that the United States has been among the developed countries, uh, per capita massive emitter of pollution, and a high energy consumer. Energy, at least, is correlated with the development that they have seen. But increasingly, I'm also hearing about homelessness in the US, and I've seen quite a bit of images around that, a lot of different things happening. What's going on around there? I'm just curious because you live there, and I think it's a good question to ask you. Can you help us understand what's going on around there? And I would expect a developed country should be able to, with its robust processes, turn things around, or maybe that's what is coming in the way. I don't know. What do you think the reasons are for all of the stuff that's going on around, and how can we avoid it if we end up there?
So I can give you some thoughts on this, because I not in the theoretical side, but on a more practical side, because I serve on the board of directors of a 200-person nonprofit organization called the Union Station Homeless Services, and it was a an important effort on my part, because no matter which part of the world you live in, social injustice of any kind is social injustice. Period. You don't have to be in the global south to tackle social injustice. It's everywhere. And whatever you can do, whatever we can do as humans and urbanists, we must try to advocate for alternatives. So the way I've understood it is, first of all, Satya and Sonal, the issue of homelessness in the United States is incomparable to the to the parallel issue in India, from two perspectives. First of all, the reasons through which it happened are entirely different, and second, the quantities through which it is going on are entirely different. So I just want to talk, just put that as a preface, that the colossal numbers of the unhoused. I don't like to use the word homeless, because I think it's a slightly derogatory term, in the sense that it immediately conjures an image of a person of a particular kind. If you just change that terminology to unhoused, I think it's a more dignified terminology that says that the current realities that they're unhoused, what they really need is a shelter or a home, which we should be able to give them. So the unhoused phenomenon in India is gone past its breaking point, because practically in every metropolitan city, you know these realities better than me. But the causes for this in India are quite clear, as they happened in the global south. It was really a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, and really the beginning of mass migrations from villages to cities, the abject inability of our cities to provide for these people, and therefore multi-generational desperation in terms of how to survive in these places. One, in search of better jobs, better life, which brought them into the cities, and second, the complete debacle of planning in India. And that is the reason we find the scenario that we are in today. And this is multi-generational, I think. So it is a issue of enormous. It is a crisis of paramount proportions that, to me, along with climate change, remains the most dominant subject in urbanism today. So if I was asked, if I wanted to dedicate in my life to just two things in the field, I would say it would be climate change and urban poverty. These are if I can devote the next whatever life I have to tackling these two issues in my field, I would go a happy man, because they are both interrelated. The more we do not give these people the adequate fundamental rights, the more rivers are getting polluted, the more wetlands are getting destroyed, And this has an enormous impact on the climate of the city and the climate change in the bigger notion. Imagine this, happening, in so many parts of the majority world. So you cannot draw a line between, oh, climate change is happening and there's urban poverty. These are interrelated subjects, and the more we understand their relationships, the better. That's number one. Now, in the United States, the strangest thing is that all of the homelessness that is happening in the United States was not out of desperation. It began as a result of wrong policy. There was racism, there was red taping, there was all kinds of things that happened in the earlier generations that created the first residues of people being unhoused. You can go into the details, but just to keep it more broad, when the mortgage programs came in, which changed the landscape of the United States and how people live, there were policies that did not allow a certain faction to be open to these programs. Some people were not given the subsidies that allowed them. Some parts of the demographic were not given by policy subsidies. This was a long time ago, not today. But these were the beginnings. So what happened is all of these sort of social aspects created trajectories that began to look at certain demographics a certain way, and that began to treat them a certain way in the city. And they were unfortunately, policy inadvertently pushed them away. Actually, it was not inadvertent, it was advertent, it was done through policy. But this was the first step to not giving them the same rights that everyone did. And this is, of course, as we know, part of history, right? I mean, we have this whole multi-generational history where everyone was not treated equally. We know that. It has happened in India, it has happened during the colonial era, it happened all over the world in the colonial era, and there were residues of it. So that is number one. That's when it started. The second aspect comes because of unaffordability, and this is a big one. So unhoused population in the US is increasing because cities are becoming unaffordable. That is the real big issue today. So if you take big metropolitan cities in the United States, the reason gentrification is such a big terminology in the education sector, intellectual sector, is because it is a real issue. Because and let's talk about why that is, but in a minute. But so gentrification raises the land values of a place. Rents become so expensive that people cannot afford it. Compared to the salaries you earned, you cannot sustain this kind of system, and as a result, you fall into the outside the water. The third issue that has been also important in the syndrome of homelessness in the US is largely the issue of just lack of access to fundamental rights in the city. So basically, you do not have equal access to your job. Your job is not close to where you live. So you have to spend a ton of money on gas prices. You have a healthcare system that is not giving you healthcare for free. So you have to pay a ton of money to take care of, a person who needs it in your family. So there are all these kind of complex policy aspects that are on a whole affecting a certain kind of demographic, and more people are finding themselves in this very precarious space now. Now, the question that we are asking, some of us are asking, is obviously, what can we do as people who are not sociologists, but urbanists? We urban designers, planners, landscape architects, etc. So to bring it to that space, gentrification, for example, if you look at it from a spatial perspective, a lot of people don't realize this, but one of the reasons cities gentrify is because people like to live in certain areas of the city. Think of how simple and how stupid this is. Because of sprawl, because 90% of your city is badly designed, you don't have tree-lined streets, you don't have a green cover, you have large asphalt, you have garages, you have too much traffic congestion, freeways. Those who can afford it don't want to live in places like that. They want to live in places where life is much better, traditional, beautiful. I can walk. So these are places where the older generation has lived, little neighborhoods that were there before, compact little walkable places. All of a sudden, they begin to gentrify because the people that can afford to come now comes and say, I'll buy a house here, or we'll do this, and land prices rise, right? So what happens is you have a demographic that has lived there for 5, 6 generations, cannot afford it now, gets displaced. Why I'm saying this is one aspect. There are many other reasons for gentrification, but one of the reasons I'm bringing this up is it proves to you that urban design matters. Imagine if you had a city where every part of the city was decent enough, not stellar. I mean, you can have expensive fences in the most expensive part of the city, but in a low-income part of the city, there is also a walkable, dignified neighborhood. What's wrong with that? That is the way traditional cities were, right? So, I guess what I'm saying is making people feel equal is more important than actually people being economically equal. I'll say this again. The important thing about urbanism today is to make people feel that they are equal, that they're living in a neighborhood that is as dignified as the most affluent neighborhood in the city, that they have the same aspect of public transit will get them to work in 5 minutes as someone else. They may not be able to afford a car, but they can comfortably go in a bus or a train to their job. They have the same access to a market and food as the affluent neighborhood. That aspect is what we are trying to do. So while these are the causes of homelessness, of unhoused, increasing unhoused demographics in the US, what the organization that I serve on the board of, what we do is we do what other organizations in parallel are doing too. We realize that these demographics have three levels of problems. There are some that are easily solvable. They are either families or individuals who have just lost their house. We can give them a temporary shelter, and over time, through funding and through all the efforts we do, give them a shelter and bring them to their fundamental right so that life can go on. That's one. There is a second aspect where the unhoused population has been on the street long enough that they're actually beginning to get affected by it. This is where you need a little bit of tender loving care. You need to spend time with them. There is a little bit of trauma there. So you have to, it is not immediate shelter. You have to work with them. So there are teams that help them do that. And then there are a third where you have gone beyond the tipping point, where either because of age or because of other things, you need serious help on a constant basis, and that is where you either find other organizations and so on. Some years ago, as part of my job as a professor, being a professor also is a way of practicing. So while I practice with clients, I also like to think I practice as a professor, because you can initiate advocacy proposals and things that you cannot do in your practice. So we did a lab with Union Station Homeless Services, where we asked ourselves in the Pasadena area, what are some other strategies we could do? And we did the lab in 2021, in 2020, right in the heart of the pandemic, because we realized that imagine, what does stay at home mean to people who don't have a home? I mean, what a question to fathom, right? You're okay, but what is going on out there? What about the hundreds of people? Yeah, and in India too. So we figured out that one of the strategies is to create micro enterprise networks, which is something I know, Satya, you will be very, very, you've been talking about this for the longest time. That there are already all these pressure points in the city that are doing extraordinary work. Churches, humanitarian organizations, food banks, this, that. They all exist. It's just that there is no line that is connecting them. So if you identify all of them, if you bring them together, if you figure out strategies on how to do this, if you go and talk to the bureaucracy about allowing this to happen on a legal basis, this is part of a planning strategy. So what I'm trying to say is the crisis of unhoused is, whether it is on a large scale or a small scale, large scale in India, smaller scale in the US, is a form of social injustice that should not be happening in our cities at all. But the observation some of us have made as planning professionals is that the starting point to begin to think about this is to tap into the already existing forces that are beautifully creating magical change in the city on small scales, like exactly all these things I'm talking about. All the other agencies, um, non-profit organizations, activist organizations who are already tackling, they are doing it in small scales. They're helping people here.
Mm.
They're doing things there. If imagine what power we could do if we now tap into these organizations, incentivize them by giving them funding, putting our resources in these places, and creating charts, not on paper, but in practical realities, that now begin to talk about collaborative ways in which all of them focus on common problems. This is what we are trying to do at Union Station, which is we are an organization that has halved the uh, unhoused population in the San Gabriel Valley over the last 10 years. There is still a
Nice.
long way to go. But we are talking of numbers that are in our local area. We're
Yeah.
talking of about 600 people that we still need to house, etc. But that is nothing compared to what is going on in India. Nonetheless, the issues are similar, and we have ties with so many of these other places that now have become partners and talk to us about how they can help as a combined network tackling this issue.
I would like to summarize by saying the journey to livability, like you said, uh, revolving around process, around local actions, trying to get trade-offs, treating the market as a friend, providing incentives and disincentives that make it, that harness the power of the market, which is kind of its own animal, try to bring it together in a nice way, needs us to work at different levels. But in the end, what you said is very interesting, is you need to make the big middle, instead of focusing on the either ends, try and make this big middle feel like they belong, or feel valued in the city. Seems to be a nice target, that regardless of where you are on the Kuznets curve of being, of developing, uh, you could still achieve these goals by trying to make whatever your extremes are, get the middle in some way active. uh, on that note, I would like to thank you, Professor, for coming on the show and talking
So
to
I want to
us.
say
And
one last thing before you thank me.
you
There's
should.
one final word that I want to put on the record, which is, while we speak about all these things, the
Mm,
most important meditation I do every day in the world of my professional field is that cities are multi-species ecology, and that is
mm,
the final word I want to put out. We are so human centric in our planning. That is the biggest problem. I mean, yes, look how much time we have spent, and we could spend 10 times more on just tackling the challenges that humans face. But I, I just want to put it out there for anyone who will listen to this, that at the end of the day, for me, the human aspects in our cities is just one. There are thousands of other denizens with whom we share our city. I think a true urbanism is a multi-species urbanism that, by default, in the same rigor that we have spoken about for humans, it opens its spheres of compassion to every creature that is out there. And that, to me, is the cutting edge of what cities ought to be. So I just want to, because your podcast started with livability, I would just want to end on the note that livability for me is not about humans. A truly livable city is a city that makes a wonderful life, whatever wonderful means, for every creature that with whom we are sharing our cities. I think that, to me, that's why I said climate change to me is one meditation. And climate change is not about what it is doing to humans, but about destroying all the ecosystems that are sustaining us and sustaining hundreds of others. So this is a whole other podcast that we could do, but I just want to leave
exactly.
you on that note, not forget that
Oh
livability
yeah.
includes all the others.
No, that's a fair point. And like you said, I thought we should focus on the hugely destructive species in the city first, and then go into the
That's good. Yeah.
harmless ones later, and try and deal with them separately.
Fair
because
enough.
we are selfish. I wanted to start with the selfish motive, so at least the selfish people start looking at this and learning a little bit, and then coming back and let's talk about the other species that we harm in our chase for livability for ourselves. Once again, I'd like to thank you for getting on the show, and a quick note to the viewers to like, share, and subscribe so we can get more interesting guests on the show and share these values. Thank you very much, everyone.
And thank you to Sonal and you for having me.
Thank
And
you.
congratulations to all the efforts that you both are doing. Very happy to see the success, and I learn a lot from them every year. So congrats, and please continue.
Thank you. We learn in every episode as well. See you all next week. Bye.